I'm going to call this meeting to order, and if Ann, if you can show that there are 6 commissioners here today. Commissioner Schlosser is absent, and if we can take a moment of silence. Commissioner Schlosser's father passed away yesterday. Thank you. This is a Commissioner's special City Hall meeting. The purpose of this meeting today is a presentation and discussion by the Utility Rate Working Group to the Commissioners and the public of a recommendation for water and wastewater rates. Just if I can explain, this meeting is a workshop for the Commissioners, and the rate committee will be presenting to the commissioners their proposals for the future of our wastewater and water rates. We will basically be questioning what Mr. Williams has put up. He's got a long presentation as well as an executive summary, some explanations of where they came from with their rates. Then the commissioners will be discussing and asking questions of the group. And then once the commissioners are finished, then we will open it up to the public if there are any comments. Just so you know, we plan to have a town hall meeting on the 13th of July, which is a Saturday at 10 a.m., probably here in this room, to go over again the presentation, and that meeting will be specifically for the public. But again, this meeting today is for us to be made aware of what the proposals are from the committee and commissioners to talk amongst themselves. Just to give you a little bit of a background on what this is all about and what this committee was set up for. If you remember back, we had hired the Abrahams Group last year to do their recommendations on our needs for our city water program as well as our wastewater program. We recently, in 2018, as you know, finished up the ocean outfall and had a substantial debt incurred because of that. And so we had to make plans to make that payable through our rates as we move forward, as well as discuss many more projects down at the plant, as well as some projects on the water system itself. Recommendations were made by the Abrahams Group, and one of the members of the Abrahams Group is on the phone with us today, Matt Abrahams, and he is open to questions as well from Mr. Williams and the group. And they took a substantial amount of time to make their proposals for the changes in our water rates and our wastewater rates. Once we got that initial report from the Abrahams Group, as many of you know, we did have a town hall in January to discuss the process moving forward. And at that point in time, it appeared that many people were worried about the rates, and so we decided to put together a committee. The committee has met, I believe, 16 times since January. This committee is made up of 4 local residents as well as 3 city staff people. The members of the committee are Kevin Williams, who is our Director of Public Works, Bruce Williams, a property owner, Deb Ward, a property owner, Roger Truitt, a property owner, Michael Strange, a property owner, and then our city manager, Sharon Lynn, as well as Bert Dukes, our Director of Finance. Each one of these members of the team, all 7, but especially the 4 members, the local members, have a substantial amount of experience, educational and work experience, in various different fields that are affected by what they'll be discussing today, whether it's engineering, finance, accounting, public administration, project planning, as well as law. Again, they have met many times over this past winter, and they've come up with some suggestions for us as we move forward. And again, it's a pretty long presentation. Please be patient. I believe the presentation itself is probably 40 pages or so, and you'll be able to see it up on the screens. This information will be available on the website once this meeting is over today. And again, hopefully this information will get out to the public prior to our town hall, and hopefully many of the questions that people have may be answered. There's also a summary of the work that they've done over the last 6 months, as well as a number of different charts. But with that, I will turn it over to our Director of Public Works, Kevin Williams.
Mayor, I'd like to make a quick comment if I could. First, I'd like to thank all the members for being on this committee. And please understand that I don't disparage you whatsoever in any of my comments. I've got the deepest respect for you. But when the mayor says, quote, "we decided to put together a committee," that's not true. I never got the opportunity to talk about it. It was a private committee, secretly formed, and we all know the story there. So again, "we" is inaccurate. And I understand that another commissioner had input on who was on there, but again, I was never given that opportunity, and I want to make sure that's clear, because I think it justifies some of my constituents coming to me and questioning whether the formation or the composition of the group was manipulative. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mayor, Commissioners. First, I just would like to start off by thanking the members of the committee that donated a lot of their time, And it was in between vacations and trying to work around people going all around the country and all around the world. But a lot of hard work went into it, and I appreciate all the time and effort you guys put into it as a group.
Thank you.
So there's what we're here for. The Mayor already talked about the members of the committee. One other thing I would just mention that the Abrahams Group has participated and conducted more than 150 of these rate studies for various clients around the country. So also brings a wealth of experience to us. There was the mission that the mayor gave us back in January.
I'm sorry, could you please introduce your members? Because I don't think most of the people know who Bruce Williams is and who Roger Truitt.
Sure. So we'll go right to left, starting on the right, Deb Ward, one of our committee members and a Rehoboth resident. Bert Dukes, our CFO, member of the staff, also a Rehoboth resident. Bruce Williams, a Rehoboth owner, right? Roger Truitt, another Rehoboth owner, and Mike Strange, another Rehoboth owner. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
I think they need a round of applause for all that effort. Thank y'all.
Yeah, they did a great job. So back to there. There was our mission, back in January, come up with something that's fair and equitable, and don't particularly try to protect any particular user group. So that weighed in the back of our minds from day one. Some of the initial guidance the mayor gave us as well. Wanted to build on the report and the work that the Abrahams Group had done last fall. Had a really good baseline of information that we could use, kind of using the same methodology with respect to the data as far as how much, the cost, the revenues, that kind of thing. So very, very helpful to us. Wanted to make sure we captured all the O&M, operations and maintenance, as well as our capital program, and capture those costs. Wanted to make sure, obviously, it was technically sound and sustainable. We didn't want it to be, something we could implement, come up with this year and this year only, and then next year we're back at square one again, trying to do something else. Particularly wanted to make sure that we talked to and addressed, the large debt service that we have. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then some other things with respect to that initial guidance that we got ready to go forward with. I want to start with just kind of bringing everybody up to speed again as to kind of who we are and what we do, just kind of some background information. This is a map of our sewer system, and the important things to note here are that the North Shores area is part of our clients. We serve the North Shore. Obviously, you got the city, and then we have the county that comes in with quite a bit of capacity, or not capacity, but quite a bit of flow as well. But that's kind of a thumbnail of wastewater collection system. This is kind of who we service, and there's kind of by percentages. The interesting thing here is that we, our in-city residents, are less than 50% of our flow. Okay, so we average about 3.5 or 355 MGD, million gallons per day through the plant, and that's who we are. That's our users. Similar kind of thing on our water. There's North Shores again that we service. And here you can see we do a lot outside of the city as well. There's the Breezewood neighborhood. We've got all the Route 1 corridor. So again, a large system, not necessarily only for the in-city residents. And if you look at the breakout here, the city users make up about 31% of the annual flow coming out from the plant, or what we produce. And if you look down at this chart, kind of shows, I just want to give you an idea of kind of who the type of type of clients we're serving. The vast majority, 96 or 7% are serviced by a 1-inch meter, and that'll be important to you later on as we get more into the presentation. But I guess to capture again, sewer, we're less than 50% of the flow. Water, we're 30-some-odd% of the flow, and we're able to sell those excess capacities to other users. The board has seen this many times. You've heard me talk about some of the conditions of our facilities. I wanted to just kind of bring everybody up to speed again. Again, we've got a huge backlog of maintenance that needs to be done at all of our wastewater facilities, both at our treatment facilities and our collection system. You've seen these pictures before. You kind of know. Some of you have been down to the plant. You've seen it firsthand, kind of the condition of the facility down there. Again, just to highlight the fact that we do need to raise revenues to pay for some of this backlog and maintenance. Similarly, on the water side, we have a nice new 10 or so years old now, the Lynch well treatment system in great shape, but we have a lot of other sections of the water system that aren't quite as new or in as good a shape. So again, the backlog of maintenance that's required on our water system is driving this need to increase revenues to pay for the required work at each of these facilities. Just a little background on the rate history. I know you've probably seen this before as well. Going back to 2000, you can kind of see the rates there. You can see the kind of the service fee or maintenance fee based upon your meter size. And again, we've harkened back to the earlier 90-some-odd% of our meters are 1-inch meters. And then you can see the various rates per 1,000 gallons. All on the water side. Down on the sewer, we saw some changes, in 2000, 2006. And then in 2009, we implemented various sewer surcharge amounts in order to help start building the bank for what we knew was going to be the outfall project and the cost of that. So that was collected at 50% starting in 2012, and I think that has continued through today. And again, just a note, our 1-inch meters are billed quarterly, and our larger than 1-inch meters are billed monthly. This, in a nutshell, is what we're here to discuss today. You can see the orange line is our projected revenues, and the blue line is our projected costs or expenditures. And as you can see, we don't come close to touching the blue line, and it goes from a low, this current year of about 400,000 deficit to, if you look out in 2024 and 25, we're at $3.5+ million shortfall each of those years. Cumulative, over the next 12 years, we're short about $25 million for what we need to do with respect to operation and maintenance of our wastewater facilities. Similarly, on the water side, again, orange is the expected revenues and the blue is our expected expenditures. And again, total, it's about 20 million shortfall over the 12 years, and it ranges from, $1 million plus, this year, and goes up to 2.5 million or so out in 22, and then stabilizes after that at a little less than 2 million a year shortfall. So those two things capture why we're here and why we need to increase the revenue. A couple other things that are going to that impacted us as we went through our process, and that I know you're aware of. The city has a $75 million debt limit. And that plays into how we used those numbers into how we were going to move forward with some of our projects. I say that because if you look at our remaining capacity in our 2 SRF loans, and just to touch, our SRFs are at 2%, we get that from the state, and we had loans at $40 million for the outfall and 12 for the wastewater treatment plant. So we have capacity left in those loans, but we have to manage that against our city's debt limit. So when we get to the various phases of the wastewater treatment plant upgrades, we think we can do phase 3, which is about $10 million worth of work by using the SRF loan, and that's how we factored that into our analysis. We don't think we have SRF capacity or loan capacity from either SRF capacity or loan capacity from our debt limit to be able to borrow for phase 4 upgrade of the plant, which is about $14 million. So in our analysis, we use capital expenditures to be able to pay for that significant project. And that's where you see that big spike and the delta grows to $3.5 million a year or so in those couple of years because of the large capital expenditure required to pay for phase 4 of the upgrade. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. Mike did a great job for us. He's going to kind of talk to us about the methodology we used, why we made certain decisions, certain assumptions, and then I'll come back up after he finishes. Mike.
Thank you. First of all, I have to apologize. I have to refer to my notes because I've had some health issues over the last 6 months and I can't be quite as extemporaneous as I used to be. So I apologize in advance for that. When we look at our system, and it's really somewhat amazing that previous administrations here in Rehoboth Beach either got very lucky or were brilliant in investing and putting in the infrastructure that we have. Otherwise, we'd have been in even deeper trouble than where we are today physically. For most of us, unless you're involved in sewer and water directly or have had experience with it or have gone to the plant, the appreciation of what that infrastructure does for us. You turn the water tap on and you get clean water. You flush the toilet and it goes away. If that didn't happen, we'd be in some real problems. But in order for that to happen, you need an infrastructure to do it. And you need an infrastructure that's designed not for yesterday or today, but it's designed for 40 or 50 years from now. Because that 40 or 50 years today that occurs, we're now 30 and 40 years out with the system that we have. And so you have to plan for the future, not for this minute. But there's a real catch to that. And that is that infrastructure, whether it's transportation or healthcare infrastructure or our sewer and water system, is only perfect for one day. Prior to that, you have excess capacity and it's underutilized and it costs too much. After that, you have no capacity, it's overutilized and it costs too much. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, but you need to have your infrastructure in place for the future, not for today. And it's very hard when we live in today, because I'm a resident and you look at it, whether you're a resident in Rehoboth or a resident any other place around the country, you look at the infrastructure and you say, why the hell do we have to? The answer is because you're putting infrastructure in not for today, you're putting it in for tomorrow. And we benefit from the infrastructure that was done by people that were visionary long ago to put in infrastructure that exists today. Now, part of our charge, and forgive me, I'm going to give a quickie lecture in terms of the questions of value and ethics. Our charge was to do and come up with a fair and equitable structure. And it's easy to say that, but what does that really mean? And you can take an entire course in that if you want, moral philosophy. But fairness is concerned with the actions, processes, and consequences that are morally right, honorable, and equitable. In essence, the virtue of fairness establishes moral standards for the decisions that affect others. We are all others. Fair decisions are made in an appropriate manner based on appropriate criteria. The catch is, what is the criteria that you use? And when you're doing a rate study, what is the criteria that you use? What is the scientific facts that you base your decision-making on that have to get translated into values? The values ultimately, which you'll see in the last slide, and ultimately that the commissioners have to deal with is, what decisions do you make based on those facts? And you determine the values. It's an interesting situation. When we looked at it, and what we did is we said maintain the existing agreements. And really what that involved was there are legal binding agreements that exist with various due dates, various termination dates, And we'd accepted that as given, because you don't want to start looking and making an analysis where you make a whole series of assumptions that you have no basis to control. So that was a given that we started with. The sewer, the relationships we have with Dewey Beach, Henlope and Acres and North Shore, water, Dewey Beach, Breezewood, and out of town. We wanted to reduce reliance on meter size as a differentiator. And the reason that we did that, while we looked at it, is we looked at what is done around the country in terms of best practices. We looked at what was done in terms of various recommendations from the various agencies, organizations, federal, state, professional organizations on what's the best way to do things. And we looked at that, and the way we were doing it really didn't make a lot of sense, because the physicalness of the meter wasn't really the issue. The issue was the amount of stuff that's going through the meter from the standpoint of the water or the flow. Borrowing capacity available for phase 3, we had to understand and appreciate what the limits were that we were dealing with. And the same thing for phase 4. Now, hopefully I won't screw this up. And I did. Whoops.
You can either do that. It'll scroll for you.
Beg your pardon?
Sure. Is that okay?
Okay. Methodology, process. Examine other communities. Local, similar communities to us that have seasonal fluctuations, communities on a national scale that don't have seasonality that we have. We looked at all the possible options that we could in the amount of time that we had. And it's very interesting is we just didn't look at 1, 2, or 3. We focused in on hundreds of communities. We then aggregated all those communities. They then looked at what they did, the decisions that they made, the processes that they followed. And what you find out is there's no singular best way. And when you look at the literature that's published by the American Water Works Association, by the various associations, the civil engineers, et cetera, they don't recommend a singular best way. What they say is you need to tailor it to the needs of your community. So when you see things where someone says, well, damn it, it should be this way, that may be because they have an inherent belief that that's the way they believe it should be done. But is that what should be done for everybody? That may have different beliefs, that may have a different approach to what you're doing. It gets back to that concept of fair and equitable, and to try to apply that in the value system that we have. So from looking at that, we evaluated best practices. Now I should point out that in my world over the years, best practices also has another term that's used. It's called least worst practices. Because you find that best practices are the function and usually come about by virtue of committees that are the result of professional organizations, and they themselves suffer from a serious case of bounded rationality. In other words, they know what they know. They really don't have a very broad systematic perspective. And so when you try to look at things from a holistic standpoint, some of those best practices, quite frankly, are terrible because they're not tailored to the community and the unique characteristics. And I can say one thing that has absolutely nothing to do with my professional knowledge. It has to do with personal knowledge. If all the doctors that cared for me over the last 6 months had followed the recommended procedure, I would be dead. Because I turn out to be a statistical outlier, a dramatic statistical outlier. I'm in the 1 in 100,000, the 1 in 70,000. And it was utterly amazing to me that if they had followed, quote, best practices, I would be dead. I would like to point out, not being dead is really great. And it gives me the opportunity to inflict myself on all you folks with this information. What we did really has its bearing, and the group that's on this team is interdisciplinary, various backgrounds, various experiences. And that's what led to a holistic approach to this. It's called phronesis. It's a technical issue. It goes back to Plato and a whole bunch of other folks a long time ago. But it's an intimate familiarity with practice in a conceptualized setting. What that means is you don't just talk about the water and sewer, you go investigate it, you go look at it, you walk the grounds, you get a feel and appreciation for what the hell is going on. Then you come back and you examine all the data you can possibly find that's practical, that you can come up with, which in itself is not easy. And you have to go much further than just looking at the internet and typing in wastewater rates. Because even with Google Scholar, it only gives you the tip of the iceberg. It doesn't go anywhere near the depth that's needed to really analyze the issues to come up with the best approach. And that's really a value judgment. And that value judgment, after all the data that we go through, everything that we've done has been based on the analytics. we, the committee, can't make a value judgment. That's what you pay elected officials to do on your behalf. What we can do, though, from the standpoint of providing truth to power, is give you the best possible analysis that we can come up with so that you can make that valued decision. Now, we're not abdicating our responsibility. At the very end, it did tiptoe and make sort of some recommendations, but at the very, very lowest level that were fully related to the analytics. We didn't tiptoe any further than that. Excuse me. Minimum usage fee. We did come up with a minimum usage fee because the infrastructure is there so that if and when you decide you wanted to use it, the rest of the population shouldn't have to pay it until you have a whim that you'd like to use it. So even if you had zero usage, yes, there is a fee associated with that. Ready to serve, administrative costs. It gets to be very difficult to try to figure out the balance in the fee structure. And again, if you look around the country, it is all over the map. And when you speak to some of the people, which I did personally at the various organizations that run sewer and water facilities, whether they're within a municipality or it's a larger regional structure, it's very fascinating because I started asking a whole series of questions that were relevant for us. And almost in every case, the administrators or the people that I spoke to said, you know, no one's ever asked questions like this. Why are you asking them? And I told them why. Because we're interested. I want to know how it's done. What do you do? And frequently the answer that I got, because in many places with the municipalities or the regional authorities, I asked, well, how did you arrive at this? Why do you charge that? And they said, well, because we can. There wasn't really any depth. Well, they could get away with it. It's what was approved. But there wasn't any rational basis for why it was being done that way. We tried to do that. And one of the things that we did, the result of all of that, is this whole concept of use more, you pay more. Use less, you pay less. That goes back to coming up with the philosophy of, well, how should we structure this? Okay, you use less, you pay less. You use more, you pay more. That seemed to be the best approach that we could come up with in terms of how do we value this? Methodology, ready to serve fee. Capture and cover administrative costs. Well, why just administrative costs? It gets back again to the physicality of the system. Do we burden people and try to put more in there? Well, if you're not using it, you really are responsible for the collectiveness of the system. And when you start to use it, now you start to pick it up. But if it's just for the ready to serve, the anticipation of use, maybe it should be related to the administrative costs. So yes, we went in that direction. Revenue recovery. Equivalent meter versus the equivalent meter method, cost versus capacity. Again, the guidance is all over the map when you look at all the professional organizations as to what you should do. And we focused in on the physical capacity from the standpoint of what's really happening, what's flowing through there. The analytics seem to support that. Equivalent meter method, capacity. And now it starts to get a little confusing. But the bottom line is, it says, is basically if you have a bigger meter, it's all related back to the smallest meter. And we do it as a ratio. Now, we didn't invent this. It is one of the areas that is recommended, one of the possible methodologies that you can use. And if you compare, for example, if you've got a 6-inch meter and the maximum flow is 1,000 gallons per minute, compare that to your 1-inch and it's essentially, it says, gosh, that's 20 times. Okay. And so you look at all the ratios and you try to relate that back to what actually happens. Now, obviously, as Kevin pointed out, the overwhelming majority of our base is in those smaller meter sizes. Again, this is a bit mind-numbing. But the bottom line is, if you look at the bottom, and I have the equivalent cost per meter, it says calculation of cost per equivalent meter. Our total administrative costs related to this are $326,372, and the total equivalent meters are $2,570. In other words, we totaled up and tried to come up with a number that took into account these different sizes. It used to be a nice chart, but it ends up being about $126.98 per equivalent meter. And then when you look at the recovery charge of that and you say, okay, here's our baseline, you now start to multiply through. Are you a 1-inch meter? Are you a 2-inch meter? Are you a 6-inch meter? Are you a 4-inch meter, et cetera? And you see the fee that's charged. Now that's very different than what previously was done, particularly on the higher meter sizes. But going back to our fair and equitable approach, why were the fees on the larger meters on the previous structure more expensive than what came in our recommendation? It's because the analytics didn't support it. And in fact, one could argue what was done in the past may have been, and I don't know this, because they could. At that point in time, the larger meter users, if you go back and compare to what we're recommending, paid more. But was that fair and equitable if you go all the way back to the start with how we're doing things? And from the analytics, it wasn't supported. So therefore, we made the decision that this is how it should be done. That is a recommendation. Consumption rate, seasonal demands. Now this, it gets somewhat complex, but really, the idea is when you look at that and you say, well, gee, and there's been some things that have been in the paper and comments that were made at the various meetings that we held by the public of this peak and non-peak. Peak and non-peak turns out to be something that we did in the past. And the question is that really the best thing to do for the future? And I would ask you again to think of this in the terms of not today, not yesterday, but for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years of how we do it, because we're underwriting the future, and it's our obligation to do that. Our peak was April to September, and October to March was non-peak. But then you look at what's happening during those periods in terms of what's happening in regard to flow. Yes, there is more flow that is during the, quote, peak season. But how does it impact the actual cost and the functioning of our wastewater system? It turns out when you look at, and we actually had a very long dialogue on this concept of fixed costs versus non-fixed versus peak and non-peak versus incremental versus standard. And suddenly all these words start to be extremely important. And so what we ended up doing was we looked at the distributed costs versus year-round operation. We looked at the distributed non-fixed costs versus the incremental flow. And we determined the result by summing the two. And it turns out, when you look at that, the overwhelming amount of expense is related to the infrastructure of our system. And some comments have been made by the public and have showed up in the press is that, well, it's all due to visitors. Well, that looks like the reality, but it's not really the total reality of the infrastructure investment that was made. The infrastructure is necessary because we expect to be around. I won't be here, but people in Rehoboth will be here in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We built that. The outfall that we have has the capacity to allow Rehoboth Beach as an entity to thrive. Also, an awful lot of, quote, the capacity isn't being utilized by Rehoboth Beach or its visitors. It's being utilized by those that we service that are outside the boundary conditions of Rehoboth Beach. We are a public utility in that sense, even though we don't meet the qualification of a public utility. That can't be forgotten, and that's a reality that we deal with. They help underwrite the system that we use every day. So when I turn on the spigot, I get clean water. When I flush the toilet, it still works. So the concept of peakness starts to change when you actually start to do the analytics and you look at it. I hope that was reasonably good explanation. It may not be. Okay, it wasn't. But if you look at the data, it'll start when Kevin comes back up and you start to see where it ends up, it will start to be a little more explanatory. And I apologize for that. One of the things that I think that has been difficult is, at least for most folks in recent history, there was a time we didn't have water meters in Rehoboth Beach, and I'm not sure if many people even know that. It just came to your house and you paid a fee. Then they found out you really need to have meters because some people use a hell of a lot more water than others, even though it's just the same house. And then it became the basis by which we do calculations. So things change over time. And we can't hold ourselves captive to the way we used to do things. In my world, there's something called twatty. Well, that's the way we always did it. That's the way we always did it. There's a very famous individual in my world that said that's the most dangerous phrase in the English language when it comes to urban planning and other forms of engineering. Well, that's the way we always did it. We can't use that philosophy as we go forward. We have to look at what gives us the best possible options for the future, even though we don't even know what the future exists. What we want to do is make decisions that are generally right and not absolutely wrong. And that was the philosophy that we followed in what we were doing. Okay, this is where we actually, to a degree, started to tiptoe and make a policy recommendation. But it's a policy recommendation that's borne out by the analytic facts, which Kevin will be going over that you'll see. Variable versus level rates. We looked at the rates versus 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 6 year. We looked at the rates over long spans of time. And we said, people have a right to be able to do planning, reasonable planning. The commissioners and the mayor have the right to try to do reasonable planning on your behalf. But when you look at the rates, when you start looking at 1, 2, and 3 years, and these things bouncing all over the place, and what you have to do, it means they'd be fluctuating, and you really can't plan. And we felt it was important to have some sense of stability, both for the system itself and also for the public, so you can figure out what the heck is going on. And when you look at that analytically and mathematically, I won't get into the area under the curve and the calculus and everything that goes into it, is 4 years seem to look pretty good. Seem to be the best possible choice to balance out our physical needs, both from a financial standpoint and a practical standpoint for the public. So there isn't the shock value. Because when you look at several of the graphs and what the investments are that are required, and I should point out, we've got incredibly good interest rates. That was one thing that was a masterstroke of time in terms of timing. So we recommend a 4-year, that is a policy recommendation by the committee, and in the 3rd year, to review and look at to see if we were in fact generally right and not absolutely wrong. I firmly believe that we will be. General fund support. One of the things within, and people may not be fully aware of this, is that within the structure of our system financially, general fund support is generated above and beyond the costs that are related to the system itself for the benefit of the local beach. We did not add in anything under wastewater. We did under water. Now, why did we make that differentiation? If you remember back to, and it's in the charts in Kevin's presentation, a lot of the water is consumed by people that are outside of Rehoboth Beach. That's a billable. They get to pay for that. We get to benefit of that. So you might argue that that's profit. It's really called enterprise contribution. But in essence, if we were a public utility, that would be profit. So we did it with water because it has a bigger base. There's more people involved in paying for it. That's a good thing.
We need you to stay close.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I have trouble doing that. Reserves. Wastewater, $300,000 capital reserve, $300,000 operational reserve. One of the things that is important is that the system needs to be fully funded. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know what calamities might befall us, notwithstanding and separate and unrelated to the maintenance issue, where you have to keep your system under condition of good repair. Things happen that we don't know. We may have more problems. We were spared from Superstorm Sandy. New Jersey got obliterated by Superstorm Sandy. Well, we've had other events occur from the standpoint of climate change, sea level rise, and we're seeing some of the impacts of that. Our system is also getting a little older, and we need to do maintenance on it to keep it in a state of good repair. We had the engineers estimate as best as they could, as best as we could, based on that data as to what you need to do and when you need to do it, so you can maintain the fact that when you turn on the spigot, you see clean water, and when you flush the toilet, it goes away. It doesn't really just go away. There's a long process related to what happens to that. Water, there was 100K in capital reserves and 100K in operational reserves. Obviously, different levels, because again, that was based on the analysis of the infrastructure that we have and what was really needed. It's a best estimate. And from an engineering standpoint, that's what you try to do. Give it the best possible estimate you can. Could you be wrong? Possibly. But you try to minimize the detriment of things that can happen with the future. Remaining surcharge funds. There's about $1.5 million that, quote, are sitting there. And what we did is, when you look at the charts that Kevin comes up, is we allocated that out over, was it 200,000? I can't remember.
250 a year.
250 a year, back within the system. So it doesn't go away or get used somewhere else. It stays within the system and helps minimize the impact over time that you see in the charts that we did. You don't have to listen to me anymore.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Professor Strange. I did not realize we were going to get back into Philosophy 101. Got shivers. My philosophy paper was not very good, I could tell you. So we're going to look at some specific numbers now and the impacts that are caused by the rates that we are recommending that you do. So on the wastewater side, thanks, Mike. Again, just harken back to the basic need for the increase in revenues. There are the rates that we are recommending. And if you look at the table, the black columns are the old rate before the interim rate. So this would have been 2018 rate. The red numbers reflect the interim rates that went into effect, I guess, with the usage starting on 1 April. And then our proposed rates are in the blue column, both by bill. And it's key, if you remember, that some bills come more frequently than the others. 1-inch meters get them quarterly, larger than one get them monthly. And if you look, there it is by an annual basis, and you can see what the ready-to-serve fee is based upon your meter size. And then there on the peak, non-peak, year-round table or columns, you can see the previous peak and non-peak rates, the current interim rates that are in effect today, and then there is our proposed rate at $14.70 per 1,000 gallons. So that's on the wastewater side. This kind of shows you how that meets our revenue requirements. So you can see we're able to stay pretty tight to our projected expenditures over that period of time. And it actually, you can see the pluses and minuses, but it also does touch on our cash flow issues that we had talked specifically about at one of the meetings that some of you attended. And this allows us to do that with this recommended rate. We then set up numerous examples, just so you can use this to compare impacts to various types of users. This particular chart are all 1-inch meters, and they're all using different amounts of flow. So example 1 is a 1-inch meter who uses 4,000 gallons per year. 2 is 20,000 gallons per year. Example 3 is 40,000 a year. 80,000 a year, and 100,000 a year. So broad range of 1-inch typical residential kind of users. And then the blue column reflects those numbers from the previous chart of what it was on our 2018 bill. It then shows in the orange what the interim rate is for each of those users. And then the first, I guess it's gray, shows what the first 4-year term of our recommendation would look like. And then the dark blue is the second 4-year term, and the yellow is the third 4-year term to get through the entire 12-year kind of window that we looked at. And you can do that for each of the particular examples based upon how much flow is expected to be used by that individual customer. And you can see, you saw on the graph that big spike out in 23, 24, 25 kind of time frame. So you can see this first year term, it's an increase, but you can see that big step also that's coming out in that second 4-year term. One of the advantages of going to that 4-year term is we took a bite out of the first peak as it was growing. So we're going to spread that over the first 4 to mitigate the larger spike that's going to happen at the 5-year mark. We did the same type of analysis using the greater than 1-inch meters. The first 2 columns are we call example 5 and 6 and 7 are 1.5-inch meters, and we took kind of a low-end usage for the 1.5, and we took a higher-end, middle-of-the-road usage for 1.5-inch meter, and you can see the various impacts for each of those users. Again, same format: the 2018 number, the interim number, and then the projected for each of the 3 4-year terms.
We also did it for 2-inch meters, and there you can see the flows that we use, a 2-inch meter with 117,000 gallons a year, and a 2-inch with 475,000 gallons per year. And again, you can see the impact to each of those users and each of those rate terms, as we call it. And then we did the same with our larger meters. There's the two 3-inch examples, one with 870,000 gallon usage and the other with about 1.5 million gallons a year. And then we did the same for our 4-inch plus meters with a low end of 1.4 million a year, and then the high end 6 whatever million a year. And you can see the various impacts to each of those. So you get a good look at each size of meter and how that impacts each of those potential customers. Similar analysis on the water side. Again, there's our the delta between revenues and expenditures that we're trying to mitigate, and there's our recommended proposal for the 4-year rate term on the water side. And again, you have the 2018 column, you have the interim column for current rates, and then you have our proposed column in blue. And again, both by bill and again by annual. And then again, we have a 1 rate, year-round rate proposed at $6.30 per 1,000 gallons. Here you can see that we are able to meet our cash flow objectives as well as meet our overall objectives. First part, this helps mitigate that spike we talked about. You collect a little bit more up front by using a 4-year term, but it then takes care of some of that spike and reduces that impact. Again, same examples, same 13 examples size-wise on the water side, so you can use that to compare. Again, 5 columns are the old 2018, the current interim rate, and then each of the 3 4-year terms in our proposal or in our recommendation. And again, all sizes. This is 5 1-inch meters. There's 2 1.5-inch, 2 2-inch meters, 2 3-inch meters, and 2 larger than 4-inch or larger meters. And we think we captured a wide range of types of users we have, so you can use that in your analysis to see whether or not that meets your needs. So combine them, there's what the overall numbers look like, by meter size for both water and wastewater cumulative or together. 1470 on the recommended wastewater rate, 630 on the water, and then the various annual charge for our ready-to-serve fee. So what does that do to us in comparison to some of the communities that we looked at in our analysis? So with our proposed rate structure, you can see a typical user of 20,000 gallons and 40,000 gallons. So we just ran those two. On the wastewater side, 20,000 gallon user is going to pay about $418 annually. And you can see where that stacks up with that same user in other communities nearby. On the water side, same analysis, 20,000 gallons and 40,000 gallons. And our Rehoboth Beach users with a 1-inch meter using 20,000 gallons a year will pay approximately $168 a year. And if you have a 40,000 gallon usage a year, you'll pay about $294 annually. And you can then also see how that stacks up compared to other communities nearby that we studied. And I think that kind of captures our recommendation. We'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Excellent presentation. I find that the graphs are very helpful, and I appreciate that. We have had a lot of constituency correspondence coming in, and I wanted to acknowledge that. And if it's not already online, I expect it would be online, embedded in the agenda shortly. And then, of course, any future communications would go online also. So again, thank you for that. A lot of the correspondence mentions a 1999 study. And I wanted to know if you all referenced that at all or had any conversation about it. And in particular, referenced within the study to, a lot of reference in the study to using the peak and the non-peak to promote conservation and have people pay for what they're using, so to speak.
So we did have that as a reference. In fact, someone took it off our podium this morning, which wasn't supposed to be a handout. But so if you picked that up by mistake, we would appreciate getting that back. But yes, it certainly was. And it goes back to that one, I think was it 99, 96, whatever the study was.
99.
99. And it talked about the peak, non-peak, and at that point, it was just a surcharge. And they called it $1 surcharge per 1,000 gallons. And they equated that to a peak. So in our analysis, we said, well, we couldn't figure out what that was really trying to capture other than, let's add $1 to it and charge somebody a little more. So when we went back, as Mike talked about, when we went back to the analytics and said, okay, what are we going to try to do and what are we going to try to pay for? How are we going to break that out? We did not really feel that was appropriate for us in our analysis. So, but we did see that as a reference. We knew what had transpired then. Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Make sure that microphone's facing you. It's unidirectional.
That good? No, okay.
There you go.
That was one of the issues that I mentioned earlier about, that's the way we did it previously and sort of ingrained in people's philosophies. And you are correct that traditionally in the past, peak, non-peak in other jurisdictions was thought of and used as a way to encourage conservation. If you look at, and I will refer to the multitude of studies that are out there, the peak, non-peak issue appears to be generally being replaced over time with an inclining block structure, which we didn't elect to do. An inclining block structure comes up with a series of increasing scales, and they're all over the map. In some cases on the water side, there can be 10 different blocks in increasing scales. On the sewer side, there can be 6 to 8. And there's no rhyme or reason to how they're segmented. But what happens is with an inclining block system, which is always defined as hoping to lead to better water conservation, is for the first 1,000 gallons, you pay one price. For the next 1,000 to 5,000, you pay another. And as a typical user, if you consume 40,000 gallons, your first 30,000 gallons is the lower price. And it keeps incrementing up. So everyone gets to benefit of those lower fees. I'll call it 40 to 60% around the country have moved towards inclining blocks. On the other hand, there may or may not be a trend that appears to be moving away from that and going more towards a structure that we did where use less, pay less, use more, pay more, and doing it as a singular fee. And it really then translates back to what I talked about earlier from a societal standpoint. It's a value judgment. So when you look at that of how do you encourage conservation, what's the best way to do it? And that ends up being a value judgment. And so you'll end up having to select how you want to approach that. What we did is almost take a zero-based budgeting approach, is to look at the core of what it takes to meet system requirements so that all of us can have clean water at the tap and have our sewage be treated appropriately. And that's what we came up with. You still have that option, whether it's peak, non-peak, inclining block, et cetera. The analytics, I believe, aren't as strong to do that. I think this may be the best way, but it still ends up being a value judgment at that point. It does encourage conservation because if you use more, you pay more, and that will continue. It doesn't stop. So if you really have, for example, in our case in Rehoboth Beach, if you don't have shower restrictors, you're going to pay more. If you don't have low-flow toilets, you're going to pay more, and you should. Water is a very valuable resource.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm sorry, were you finished?
Yes. Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
I didn't want to forget my question.
And Roger had something as well.
I'm sorry, on this issue of peak and non.
Sure. Go ahead.
We debated this quite a bit in our meetings. And actually, as it turns out, and if you wanted to get really into the weeds or granular, I think is the term that's used today, we probably should have Matt address this. But peak and non-peak is inherent in the rate you're seeing. And the reason for that is because we don't call it that, we call it fixed and non-fixed. And the total rate is a combination of those two costs. What do we mean by non-fixed? Non-fixed costs are those that vary depending on the amount of flow. So in the summer, you use a lot more electricity at the water and wastewater facilities. You also use a lot more chemicals. Those are non-fixed costs, and those are calibrated in our rate based on peak flows. On the other hand, there are certain fixed costs. The people that have to run the plant are there basically year-round. They might add a person or two in the summer. And we actually asked about that, and we pulled that one or two persons out and put them in the non-fixed to try to be as fair and equitable as we could. So we do have a peak and non-peak aspect that's inherent in our rate. You have to get into the numbers to see it. And let me just say, when we started this process, I own residential property, and I think most of the other people on the committee are either residents or own residential property. I came in with the preconception that based on meter size, which early on we determined had no rational, I shouldn't say have no rational basis, did not have a good rational basis. Because simply put, if a 1-inch meter, somebody's using 80,000 gallons and somebody's using 20,000, and we have that, as you saw from the figures there, should they be paying at the same rate because they have a 1-inch meter? We said, that doesn't work. Okay, so we looked at what is the actual flow. I came in with the perception that, okay, the big users, we had to build these big facilities and we have to have all these people. I thought they were getting a break. But when you get down into the weeds of the analytics and you properly assign what are fixed and non-fixed costs, we found that that wasn't the case. And so what we came up with was a rate structure that we think is more equitable based on the actual flow, based on the size of the facilities that are there. And as Mike alluded to, and I would agree, what's gone before us has been very valuable in terms of a lot of that's been paid for. What is not is at bond rates that are very low interest rates. So the existing infrastructure we have, which is in many cases designed for peak, Rehoboth got at a very cheap price. And I think that's reflected when you look, if we should leave that up there, because I think at the end of the process, we didn't look at this at the beginning. We did the analytics, what we thought was fair and equitable, and at the end, as a cross-check, okay? As a, does this pass the red face test in what we've done? We looked at what it compared after we did our analytics. And guess what? When you look at comparably sized resort-type communities with the new rates and with, the upgrades that really are necessary and to pay for the outfall, we're in pretty good shape.
I have Mike, you mentioned a term and I didn't hear inclining something.
Inclining block.
Block,
Inclining block rate. And what it is, it's incremental.
like tiers.
It's tiers, and in essence, as a user, regardless of your size, if you were running, for example, a large commercial facility that used millions of gallons a year, your first 1,000 gallons would be at that same low rate that a consumer might pay. Now, I should check that. The other part, there's block rates, but then those same tiered block rates are also segmented by residential, commercial, industrial. So the number of rates keep getting bigger and bigger and larger, but philosophically, it's inclining block that applies to across the board to all of them. I even ran across a case of where it was inclining blocks, and they had something called residential used as commercial. And what that was is, and if you had a rental license, you paid commercial rates. You paid more than if you were just a user of a house as a resident, you lived there. So there's a whole host of different approaches. But yes, the inclining block is an incremental approach that everyone, if in a classification, pays the first 1,000 gallons at the low rate, and then it just keeps incrementing up until you get to your final bill, is the summation of all of that.
Maybe that segues into my next question, and that has to do with a lot of the constituents' letters have to do with questioning that this proposal favors the large users and that the residential users subsidize the large users.
No.
And
I would say the answer to that is no. And one of the things that, as I alluded to earlier and was brought up, is the fact the infrastructure we have, if you look at the infrastructure, and some of the comments people say, well, Jesus, we're paying for something we didn't need because it's all the visitors. That really isn't the case. We're paying for infrastructure that we need in place so that it's there for people that come after us and that we need now. And depending on which number you want to look at, 40 to 50% of the utilization isn't based on us. It's based on other users outside of the confines on the water side. So it all ends up building, and the infrastructure is there for the future. So I can't, it doesn't favor big users. This is basically a fair and equitable approach that goes back to what my original statement was in trying to do that. If, as commissioners, you determine, now that you have baseline data, which is what you have, in other words, there isn't anything in there that's weird or has any bias in any, we tried to eliminate that, you may elect to make other decisions. But now you have a core of data that you can accept as is, or you may modify it and say, well, you know, you think the inclining block may be a better approach, or some segmentation in some other way. But in order to do that, you need hard baseline data that isn't colored by various perspectives.
So it was very enlightening, the fixed versus a non-fixed cost. That, I appreciate that, because what I believe you said was inherent in those fixed and non-fixed costs is sort of a peak, non-peak use. And I think that's very important for people to understand. And I appreciate the fact what you're saying about we are not skewing this either way, fair and equitable, and I think that is the proper way to go.
Right. Well, to do otherwise would be inherent bias in doing it. And quite frankly, as a researcher, you go out of your way to have that happen. And it's very difficult. We all have bounded rationality, and you have to fight it all the time so that you come up with basically raw data so you can make an effective value judgment. These are just facts and evidence.
You know, on the question of conservation, you know, I looked at my own personal bills, and at my house, I have two water meters. I put in a second water meter about 10 or 15 years ago for irrigation, and so that's all it's used for. So the reason I did that was because if I had kept it on one meter, then my irrigation, I would have had to pay wastewater fees for. So I've got two separate meters, one for just the house for the two of us, and it's a little over 40,000 gallons, and my irrigation is about 80,000 gallons. And so for the irrigation, I just pay the water fees. But what it also made me think about is I looked at that 80,000, and some comments from people is, geez, maybe, you know, in the heat of the summer, I shouldn't have my irrigation on 7 days a week. Maybe I should have it on 5 days a week. And I think with these rates and basically things being updated, I think this will lead to conservation by some. And if not, as everybody on the committee has said, is you use more, you pay more. And I think that's what really comes out here more than anything else, is everybody's got access to the system, which everybody needs, but you use more, you pay more. And as you look at this chart, and I'm glad we left this chart up too, because if you think about all of those communities, I don't know of any community that has the anticipated debt service that we're going to have as we move forward. And these are rates as we move forward. If you remember, these are rates over the next 12 years. Well, these are the first 4 years, but as we've been putting in these rates, they're to pay for all the work that has to be done over the next 12 years. And some of it is based on our debt service, and we can borrow. But there's an awful lot, all of the water, which is 12 plus million, and much of the sewer, another 15 to 20 million, that we don't have debt capacity for, so that we're having to collect that over the next 12 years, and that's why these rates are where they are.
I did have a question about the Dewey, the slide of the existing water users and the wholesale only. I'm not sure I understand. So they don't have, we're not saying anything about the size of their meters.
Correct, because it is truly a wholesale to Dewey, and the county distributes it. So we don't partake in their distribution system, we're just bulk water.
And they're billed by the county then?
correct, but they're billed on an EDU basis by the county because there's no meters out there.
And we bill the county.
We bill the county.
One bill.
So,
And Bert may be the one that needs to, Bert Dukes, to confirm this, because he's looked at, but we looked at the agreements. And the thing to keep in mind, as these rates go up for city users, they also go up for the wholesale users. So part of what you're doing, and you saw for the water system, the city only contributes about 31% of the demand. So what that tells me is that about, 69% of that is being funded by out-of-city users. And so when we raise the rates to do what needs to be done to generate the revenue, to keep these systems running properly and up to current standards, that's really being funded on a proportional basis by the out-of-city users. So you're not only raising the rates in the city, you're raising the rates for these other users in a fair way. Is that a fair thing to say, Bert?
uh,
The out-of-town users currently pay double what the city rate is. Breezewood being an exception, they had an agreement they made back in the 70s and provided for 1.5 times. So I think the Rehoboth residents get a pretty fair deal on that.
and so do our contracts allow us to immediately increase these fees to these different jurisdictions, the county, North Shores, et cetera? Or are we on a timeline where it might be 4 years before we can?
Well, we control the rates for the out-of-town customers, with the exception of Dewey Beach, which is a wholesale arrangement. Now, that rate has trended up, and I believe it's established by negotiation. And I don't recall the rate now per 1,000 gallons, but it has been going up. So I think the commissioners have the power to negotiate that with the county.
Correct.
Annually.
And I think the other agreements with respect to North Shores and Breezewood, those are set in the agreements as 1.5 times the city rate and 2.5 times. So I think they would be able to be implemented right away.
And if I can just make 2 quick points. The place where there is not the incentive to conserve is the wholesale agreement with Dewey, because they're on EDUs. There's no incentive there. And for the people looking on this chart, seeing Tidewater, who don't know what Tidewater is, that's a for-profit company that services, I'll call it Greater Rehoboth, not the city, but beyond the confines of the incorporated limits of Rehoboth. So think our neighbors who say they're in Rehoboth Beach, but that's because they're in the zip code, not because they're in the city.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, Bruce.
And I don't know that it makes any difference for the comparison. I find it interesting, but I go back to the very early preface of Mike in that, we have to do what we have to do. We can't necessarily model other towns. But I do find it interesting. Some of these towns have their own well systems, water systems. Some have their own wastewater systems. Some don't. Bethany Beach, for instance, doesn't. But otherwise, it's a good chart.
Yeah, and that was one of the things I was trying to emphasize is if you look down these other communities, they don't have the outstanding, they didn't do the project that we just did last year that we spent $40+ million on and now we have to pay for. Many of those may have plants, but were paid for years and years ago. And as Mike, I think, mentioned, or Roger mentioned before, the plant that we have existing right now was built back in the 80s, and I believe about 85+% of that was paid for by grants.
I think that, to all your points, it's very important, especially looking at this, and as Roger pointed out, we didn't do this till the very last, and said, gee, let's go back and look, and we were surprised and said, son of a gun. That's good news. And to your point, Mr. Mayor, and it's very important, in several of the communities that we talked to, it was very fascinating, whose actual rates for water and wastewater are much higher than ours and not on this chart. They had infrastructure that had been, in one case, the infrastructure had been built by the WPA. I don't know if everyone's familiar with WPA. It was by the Roosevelt administration. And it was fully paid for over and over, and yet their rates were higher. because they could. And they needed it to fund the other aspects of their government, and there's nothing wrong with that. We're really blessed with the infrastructure that has been put in, and it's going to hold us in good stead. And the maintenance that needs to be done, even when you take all that into account, you end up seeing rates like this. So this has really set us on a course for the future where it's not going to cost us a bloody fortune to maintain what we have. And I think that we didn't know what was going to happen. And when we finally did this, it came to me as a surprise. It really did. And a pleasant surprise, and that's the kind you like.
So just a curiosity, on this slide, this is what one could be planning for the next 4 years?
That is correct.
Okay.
If you're one of those 20 or 40.
Yep.
And interesting, Mike, to go to your point too, is if you look back on, Rehoboth, and as we said, that about 85+% of it was paid for outside of the city and outside of rates. I think that's one of the reasons why over the last 20 or 30 years, our rates have been so low, and we've still been able to contribute to the capital funds or the general fund from water and wastewater, is because we weren't paying that, didn't have debt service, we didn't have outstanding debt, and so the rates were because we could, from the times back in the 80s. And whereas now, all of a sudden, we do have a substantial amount of a loan to pay back, and that's what's really pushing up these rates more than anything else.
But even with that, to your point, the standpoint of the enterprise contribution, that's in there.
Yeah.
But it's driven by the water side, and as Kevin points out, that was specifically done analytically because it's distributed over a larger base. As Roger said, 70% of the people aren't within a large number of the people are not within the confines of Rehoboth Beach, and they're contributing to our infrastructure, and that's terrific.
I want to commend Kevin and this team. I mean, this team has served our city well, given hours and hours and hours of your time since many months ago, and thank you very, very much for all this. One of the criticisms that I've read in a number of the letters that have come from residents is that we should have brought in an expert outside consultant to do this work. Now, I read early on the bios on each of you, and I know that there's a great deal of expertise here that we haven't publicly talked about today. And so I think that there's a tremendous amount of expertise. But how do you defend against that you all did this work, and that you didn't bring in an outside so-called expert consulting group to do this for us?
Well, we had that. We had Matt Abrahams and the Abrahams Group that did so much work in the fall, and then we had them with us on this team. So I don't know why that comment even comes out. The team has done 150 plus rate studies for other communities. That would be an expert in my mind. And you've heard Roger and you've heard Mike talk. They qualify as experts in my mind, just listening to them. So you can judge whether or not you think we have adequate folks or adequate expertise on this panel. I would take issue with anyone that would say that. So.
And just Commissioner Byrne, the Abrahams Group has been working on this for about 18 months now. So they did their work way before the rate study group got together.
Thank you.
This may be selfish to say this, but we do constitute expert ability. And the fact that we work for free is a benefit to this organization, because before I retired, I got paid a hell of a lot of money to do the exact same thing. I hold a PhD in urban planning. I've consulted around the world, whether it's for sewage treatment or water or nuclear power plants, or a whole series of things that I have done. And I don't tout that, but it's a background that I have. And the main key is interdisciplinary. I hold 2 engineering degrees, several certifications. So yes, personally, I am an expert, and it can be applied to a variety of areas, as several of the other people on the committee have expertise. And I think what happens is probably due to a lack of understanding, and people tend to say, well, experts say. even though, quote, I am an expert, I question at every stage of any kind of research is who the experts are, what their basis is, where they're coming from. And when you have various organizations, there's something that crops up, which is called institutional ignorance, where experts tend to become so narrow-minded in what they're doing, they only apply that which they know formally, and they fail to go outside that envelope of knowledge. And that's really one of the keys, if you really want to know what you're doing, is you have to be exceedingly interdisciplinary, and it takes a lot of time and effort, and you have to constantly challenge your assumptions. And that's why in this study, we didn't go in with any assumptions. We went back to ground zero and built up and saw what the results could be or might be. And then at the very end, we saw these, and it was startling, quite frankly. I mean, you work that whole time, but you're working on all the details and combining it so that you can come up with the best possible future decision for everybody. And that's really what the key. We weren't trying to focus on any particular thing. So yes, you have a lot of experts that worked on this. As Kevin pointed out, and I'm very proud of that research. Thanks.
As are we, and again, I commend all of you for your tremendous service to our city, and thank you for sharing what you just shared.
And I again would like to, thank you all for the hard work that you've done and the expertise that you individually and collectively brought and continue to bring to this. I was most encouraged by the fact that you've challenged all the norms, and you all were well versed in what needed to be challenged, and that you took a bottoms-up approach to the analytic work that you've done. And I just really commend you for doing that, and I think the results speak for themselves, so thank you for that.
Have we gotten their applications or mini bios online yet?
No.
That was suggested before, and I think for the parking task force as well as this group, and I think it would benefit our constituency to know who these people are. 'Cause like Mike said, he's got an impressive background, as do I'm sure the others.
Get that ready. Thank you. And by the way, Mike, thanks for that rate that you're charging us. We appreciate that, as well as all the rest of you. Your time and efforts are much appreciated. Obviously, Matt, you're on the phone. Your time and efforts are really appreciated as well. I know, I looked at some of those workbooks as you guys were going through your meetings, and they were pretty extensive, and they went on for pages and pages. So I know all of the work that you guys have been doing has been very exceptional, and really appreciate all the work and efforts that you guys have put into this.
I just have I don't have a great deal of questions at this point, having gone to several of your meetings as you were preparing all of this. But one thing that kind of jumps out at me with all the conversations that have gone on around town, and Mr. Truitt hit on this just a minute ago, along with everybody else, the notion that peak versus non-peak is inherent in these rates, I think is extremely important for our community to understand that. And as I was just quickly looking back in the slides, for the next iteration of this, which to me it gets even more important as more people start to pay attention, I couldn't really find something where we defined what's in the fixed cost, what's in the non-fixed cost. Maybe it's in the appendix or something. Kevin, it might make it a little easier for discussion because it is a complex subject with lots of moving parts at the moment.
And we wrestled really hard
Yeah.
with how far into the weeds we want to go. I mean, there's an example of kind of the operational maintenance costs. I think this was off of the wastewater, no, it's on the water side, broken out by, capital versus operational versus maintenance, and it gives you a total for each year. So this kind of data is in that workbook.
Yeah.
To bring the workbook up and try to puck through it that
No.
you really can't see on the
No.
screen. Yeah, so we went another direction.
Yeah.
But that underlying data is there. We have I'll give you a sample. There was kind of a cost allocation table where we talked about breaking out the fixed versus non-fixed, and that's just a small snapshot of the window of the budget line items that we went manually through, and the group did an assessment of what should it be? Is it 50%, 50%? Is it 90-10? Is it 101, 0 the other? So that's the kind of analysis that's embedded in that workbook that we worked through, but it doesn't do any good to really show that on the screen because you can't see it.
Well, I mean, for me, the fundamentals of all this, it's extremely strong. And the background work that everyone has put into it, or I would have been really silly to keep coming back to your meetings if it wasn't developing that way. So
Yeah,
Thanks for your help and participation.
you're welcome.
What Kevin just pointed out, I think it's important to know that it wasn't the committee that came up with the numbers and said, well, I think make it 40, make it. We went back to all the city employees, the specific people that did the specific jobs at every step of the way, and then got into the allocations of what their duties were and the work that they performed. And the same thing for that was how it was done. We got down to the absolute baseline and then built up from there. So it wasn't arbitrary on our point at all.
Thank you.
One other thing, and I should divulge it. I was an engineer so long ago that it was called sanitary engineering. Now they call it environmental. But I was interested to know what aspects of the system, both capital and operating, should be fixed and non-fixed. And so I asked Kevin to go back to the consultant who is designing these systems, who knows them the best, and tell us, okay, what percentage of the outfall should be fixed and non-fixed? What percentage of a particular pump station should be assigned in that? So we did go into the detail. We went through several iterations. And that's why when we got our first charge at our first meeting in January, the deadline was you got to have this done by March because we're going to set the rates in April. Well, here we are because we went through so many iterations of this with Matt Abrams, fine-tuning and asking all the hard questions.
Thank you, Roger. If we don't have any more questions from the commissioners, if anybody in the audience has any questions, and obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, the details of this presentation, and there's a chart that will also, that has rate comparisons for a number of different communities above and beyond the rate comparison that Kevin spoke about. There's also an executive summary, but all of those things will be on the website in the next day or so, so that you can read them and have them physically if you print them out, or that anybody else in the community can read and speak to, so that they're a little bit more well-versed coming into the July 13th town hall. And again, that'll be scheduled approximately 10 a.m. in here, July 13th, which is a Saturday, open to the public. And our hope would be the same type of presentation is made, same group can make that presentation, and then open it up to any questions from the constituents. Anybody, please? Come on up. Oh, you want to use that one? Oh, sure.
I'm Jay LaGrie. I live on Prospect Street. Kevin, did you folks think, I'm going to ask this question because Commissioner Schlosser is not here and she'd be asking it right now. Did you folks consider incremental increases? I know that Mr. Dukes calculates the costs and the out years by figuring cost of living. Did you do that on revenue and see just the least painful of all rate increases are the incremental increases? That's why our electric company does that every year. Did you calculate anything along those lines instead of the block 4-year raises?
Maybe I'm missing some of the question. You're asking, did we
Did you?
analyze the fact that costs go up a percentage each year and build that into that, or?
Yes, and you did that, I know, because your revenues show that.
Right.
But, excuse me, your costs show that. And I know that Abrams did that. Did you think about doing the same thing for our rate fees instead of having 5% and then go 4 years and then have 5% more, 10% out in 20, whatever it is, and then 10% down?
So you're saying a variable one each year?
According to cost of living and inflation and the things that make the rates go up, labor is like 6%. I think you calculate energy at 5%, you calculate cost of living like at 2.5%. Did you do that in the rates and the revenue that you're going to generate?
Yes. Matt, you can maybe speak to that better than I, how that was built into the workbook?
Sure. So the way that we calculated rates in the workbook was, as was just mentioned a moment ago, we first determined what the expenditures were, or at least the projected expenditures were, for the next 12 years, including FY20 as the first year, and projected out what known revenues, I shouldn't say known, but expected revenues might be the better word, that were not tied to rates. So other things that the city collects on the revenue side, we projected those out, and then we kind of took the difference of those two to say, well, here's the remaining requirement that would be tied to rates, and we set rates such that that requirement was covered.
If you understand the question, take a shot at it. Yeah.
Let me ask it of Matt. Matt, I think what I heard the question to be is when you were projecting out costs for both water and wastewater year by year, you were building in, I'll call it an inflation factor or a cost of living for salary increases, for increases in electric and those kinds of things. My understanding is those were included basically on an annual basis, it wasn't just considered at the end of the 4-year period.
Yes, that's correct.
Matt, why didn't you do the same thing on the rates that we're paying?
Yeah, I don't know.
You're talking about having the rates slowly increase every year rather than jumps every 4 years.
Those are the least painful increases.
Right, that's what you're talking about.
Well, I think if you go back to, our initial, that delta, on either one, water or wastewater, it doesn't make it. It just doesn't. 5% this year doesn't get it. You're at a negative cash flow early on.
I'm not talking about the amount. It's talking about that it stays level for 4 years and jumps. You can get the same total revenue by setting it whatever you want, by having it go up per year.
Yes.
And that's what he's talking about, I believe.
Well, and that's what I asked him. Is he talking about a variable rate? So there's the rate change every year, okay, wastewater. If you just changed it each year to meet your expenses from that year. And you go from whatever, just under 10 to 27. There it is on the 2-year window, if that's what you're looking for, and how it balances out. And if you go, wrong way. If you go to the 4, which is the one we kind of looked at, it mitigates a lot of that big spike up there, but you pay a little bit more up front, but then that step at year 5 is not nearly as large as it would have been previously. Does that get where you're going?
I think one thing that gets at where you're going is, you're talking about those steps that change year to year with inflation, with cost of living, all those things. And what's driving this chart is capital.
Yes, indeed. We just instituted a 60% rate increase. And instead of holding steady for 4 years and then getting a block jump and then holding steady for 4 more years and get another block jump, why don't we just do the cost of living, cost of commodities increase incrementally every year? That's what other cities do. If you look at a lot of other rates and a lot of other cities, you'll see the incremental increase every year, or sometimes 2 years.
And I guess you could do that as long as you build in the capital
Well,
costs.
financially, you'll be ahead if you do that incrementally.
Because go back to the 4
This
years.
is in the weeds, and I'm gonna stop talking.
The 4-year? Yep.
The one that shows the gap here and then changing.
The wastewater.
Was that?
That one?
No. There's one that shows the revenues ahead in those first couple of years,
I know where you are.
and then it crosses and follows that one,
There's one.
like that. And so what this is setting up is with a 4-year level rate, you're collecting a little more in years 1, 2, and 3 because of that, but then it tracks. I guess you could do something that set up a rate that incrementally changed in each of those 4 years based on this number. But then what we were setting up as was, gee, do you want to be setting rates every year, or would you rather have a period of time where you know that you have level rates, the customers know that they have a level rate, and then consider at year 3 whether this is all working, whether it's the way you want to go, and then proceed to year 4. You've got a system that works, as opposed to you have to do something to change something.
You can do that, but you're gonna have a shock every 4 years.
You're going to have a shock to deal with this change in 23, 24, 25, no matter what.
Jay and I have long discussions about these things, but Jay made an assertion, and he said most or many do every year. In this area, there turns out that there are some, but if you look at, and the research that we did, you will find both sewer and water districts where they explicitly locked in rates for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 years, essentially doing this. However, I would go back to what I said earlier. That is a policy recommendation by this group. Our facts and evidence show we think it's the best alternative for the future based on everything that we know going forward. So I'm only challenging the fact that you said most or many, and that isn't the case. It's just a process, and you may elect to do something different or to do that. But this is where we ended up on the analytics.
May want to go over there.
No, I need some help. I want to show some tables. If you can help me. Please bring this up.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Donna Mabry, 221 Hickman, and I'm here to, I appreciate all the work that the committee has done, and they are indeed very competent people, and they brought in a new perspective toward our rates. It's a very, it really is a philosophical and value approach. And early on in their research, they determined to take a certain philosophical tact, and I can appreciate that. But I also want to present to you the alternative of what they have decided against, and this is the peak, non-peak, or demand rate approach. And essentially what their approach has been is that the more you use, the greater the flow, the more you pay. But when you think about demand rates, what they're really looking at, the more you cost a service, the more it costs to produce your water, the more you should pay. And it's a very hard concept to get, because when this whole discussion first came up, I thought, well, are peak rates really fair? And I learned, well, to understand that, you have to understand demand rates. Demand rates are different than consumption or flow rates, okay? That's what the utility experts look at. It's a hard concept. The only way I got it was when through internet research, that I came across a concrete example that I got it. So I presented that here for you, for the commissioners, for the public to understand, because this is what the value is going to boil down to, your choice. Could you enlarge it just a little bit more, please?
Probably the extent of it. You can just look at that one.
This is an example. Okay. So let's say you have a town that has a certain group of people, and they need 2 million gallons of water a month. And that comes to 24 million gallons a year. Okay, and so to meet this need, they create a simple system. They build a well, they have a pump, water tower, 2 staff, and the total cost of producing this 24 million gallons of water over a year, it comes to $55,000, or it comes to $2.29 per 1,000 gallon, okay? Now, Now, let's say you have a group of people move into town, there's a seasonal business that develops, and a new group of people move into town. And this group of people, they also need 24 million gallons in the year, except they want all their water within 3 months. They want it all within 3 months, okay? So your system is sized to produce only 2 million gallons a month, but this new demand, you have to produce another 8 million gallons a month. So that is another quadrupling of your system. Well, your system is such that you can't just produce all that. You know, your system is sized at 2 million. So you have to build out your infrastructure, okay? Now, if it were a purely linear relationship, and that for every 2 million you need a well and a pump and a tower, okay, that could quadruple the cost that it costs to produce that next 24 million gallons of water. And that would put the cost up around $9 per 100,000 gallon. Okay, but chances are you can build out your infrastructure at some economy of scale, okay? So this is just assuming, let's say to meet that next 8 million gallons, you can build 2 larger wells that each do 4 million a month. And they cost you a little bit more, so let's say it's going to cost you $30,000 there. You buy 2 larger pumps, they're going to cost you a little bit more than the first one, so $3,000. 2 larger water towers, a certain cost. You need 4 additional staff, okay, at the same rate. And so the total cost here is $125,000. So it's going to cost you $125,000 to produce this next 24 million gallons of water. It's the same amount of water, but it's costing you much, much more to produce it because you've had to build out your infrastructure so much more in order to provide it that quickly. Okay, and so that's your demand cost. Anytime a utility is having to produce some commodity and faster to keep up with all the extra demand, they have to build out their infrastructure and dramatically build it out, okay? And so that's the demand cost, and then those seasonal people, the ones who are using the 24 million gallon in 3 months, they're costing you far more to service because for this second 24 million gallons, it's going to cost you, with this infrastructure, $5.21 a 1,000 gallons, okay? So, and what utility experts deal with all the time is that, well, you can, the ones we've had, I mean, the ones that the Rehoboth used in 1999, that utility expert talked about this and used. 20 years ago, the expert. Yes, and I think we should also point out that the Abrams group, who looked at it, their first recommendation was to maintain the peak rates. Their recommendations maintained that. Now, it's only with, as we looking at it and digging at everything from the bottom that we've come up with a different approach. But I'm just trying to explain to you the whole concept of demand and how it can be so much more to produce any utility if you're demanding it faster, okay? So then it becomes down to, and then how do you equitably bill for this? Now, if you use an annualized average rate for these 2 groups, it's costing, for the 48 million gallons throughout the year, the average cost is $3.75 per 1,000 gallons. Now, if you look at that price, that's like 164% of what it actually costs to provide for the year-round people, okay? But as far as it's only 72% of what it costs you to provide for the seasonal group of people, okay? So you're ending up with, do you have your low demand, steady consumers, do you have them subsidize your high demand, your seasonal people? And all utilities look at this. You know, electricity, it used to be with telephones, airlines, et cetera, tolls, road tolls, et cetera. Okay. And how has typically been used, and what Rehoboth has used, is that to make it fair, you charge a demand rate. You charge more when your expensive customers are using the system. Okay?
Donna, could you kind of bring it to a halt?
Yes, I will.
You've been around 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So they add peak rates. You have to charge when the people who are the most your expensive customers, because they're creating the demand, you have to charge more at that time. That's what Rehoboth has done, okay? Now, we talk about how what we've had has really worked well for us, that the approach to our water and sewer system has been an excellent approach. We're in good shape. So the question is, why do we change that? Why do we change that at this point? It's worked for us for now. Why change it? Also, thinking about the future, what do we anticipate in the future? Well, I would think in 30 years, we're going to continue to be a seasonal community with a resort with lots of visitors. So, and we have such a small year-round population, even when you include all the other areas that we service, you can't expect that small year-round group to subsidize and fund the seasonal people. Okay, so I think for the future, we need to have those people who visit in the season or the business activity in the season, we need them paying for the costs they create for the system. And it's like we look at our wastewater facility. It is sized to serve 35,000 to about 42,000 people a day. Well, Rehoboth's resident population year-round is 1,500. We factor in all the other communities, maybe we're up to 2,500 year-round people. So you can see that whole system is really set up to serve the seasonal.
Okay, Donna.
And
Please, thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot in there that's pretty compact. I think the commissioners received a copy of it, but what I'd like to do is suggest, of course, that be put online, and that gives everybody else the opportunity to read it and absorb it, but also it gives the committee the opportunity to look at it,
Right.
and maybe if they choose to respond to it at the town hall meeting. But that's a lot to
yes,
try
I don't mean to go
absorb.
into it all, but again, it does boil down to a philosophical value choice that you'll be making. Do we charge simply based on flow, or do we charge them what it costs to serve these people? And the incremental fixed cost rates do not begin to get at the demand costs. They don't even touch it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Which one? Yeah, sure. But I would just say, Donna, we appreciate, I mean, you came to many of the working group meetings and participated, and we listened to you. We honestly did. But I'll put the research of this team against something you found, an example you found online. So, okay. But you made some comments, to stress, who the experts are and who they aren't. I would stand by what this team did, well above what you found on the internet. I'll just leave it at that.
Please, Donna.
Yeah.
You had your 8 minutes, please.
So Mike asked me to put this up.
Hold on. All right, hold on.
I want just to show you something. This isn't 100% the case, but all right. So here, this is a table that's in the packet, and it just shows in the water case. This is our current, right? We use this to do the analysis between the other cities. This is the interim where we went up 30% on each, and then the proposed. This is kind of where we are at $6.30 per 1,000 gallons and $10 and something for the service fee. So typically, the difference between the peak and our non-peak that we've charged on both water and sewer is about 47% higher for the peak than it is the non-peak. So if you just pick a number, and I'll just show, because we're up at around $6.30, so if we use $6 for our peak, and we use non-peak at whatever, 47% less than that is probably what, $4.50? $4.50? Come on, smart math, guys. All right, we're going to say $4.50, and the service fee we're going to use the same as 0.56, right? Okay, so the difference between I'm sorry, let me come over to the 20,000 gallon user. All right, all right, so a 20,000 gallon user under this peak, non-peak at those two rates is 154, okay? Our proposal is 168, $14 a year, a year. So if that doesn't make you believe that our fixed, non-fixed piece is calculated into our rate, I don't know what will. So it's off by $14, but that is figured in there. And that's the kind of analysis we did to try to come up with what is the most fair and reasonable for everyone. So, Mike?
That's what's very important. And to Donna's point against the demand rate, and I can speak with vast authority because I worked for a major utility and did exactly this. And you are correct, they do demand rates. However, in this particular situation, and if you're an electric utility is a good example, the only thing you focus on is providing electric power, period. That's what you do in the demand. In this particular case, we have a unique situation where when you isolate and you say, well, the tourists do this, it's a we, they. Well, it isn't a we, they, it's an us. Because what's missing in the equation that was done for the utility are the benefits that accrue within our community that the visitors permit us to have, even though we put up with a lot of crap, quite frankly, when there's an influx of visitors, if you're a resident. The reality is that those visitors contribute in terms of the dollars that go into the coffers in Rehoboth Beach. So there's more there than just this. I'm not referring to you, but I'm referring to the phenomenon. When you use a demand rate strategy, you're focusing in on a singularity, which in that case is electric, from a utility, which is a for-profit organization. In our case, we're dealing with something which is a public service, and we can't isolate out. We could, but it would cost a hell of a lot of money and take a lot of time to look at figuring out what is the other incremental contributions that the visitors are here that contribute to the coffers within Rehoboth Beach that permit us to do what we do. So we can't isolate that phenomenon. We can, ultimately, but as was just pointed out, the peakness that's in our rates, we're off by $14 in that example. So I would have to say analytically, that services the need that's being expressed.
Thank you, Mike. We'll go to the next gentleman.
Mark Betchkall, 98 Sussex Street.
Wait a minute. Let her turn on the microphone. Thank you.
Mark Betchkall, 98 Sussex Street. What is in the ready to serve? What is ready to serve fee? I mean, I know the amount, but what is that?
Right, so the ready to serve fee is for, it's called a service fee now, I think, on your bills, but and we tailored it to try to recover the administrative costs of managing the system.
So it's
the the guys that are reading the bills, the preparing the bills, that kind of thing.
So a home or an apartment or condominium that sat empty for a year would only pay the ready-to-serve fee in that year and make absolutely no contribution to the infrastructure.
If you use no water, you would not pay a consumption fee. You would pay just the ready-to-serve fee.
So the depreciation, the cost of the infrastructure is covered only through consumption, not by merely being a part of the system.
I think that's the case, yeah.
Okay. I have a fundamental problem with that because there is value being extracted by a home or a condominium or any other business for being attached to the system. And we need to find a way to capture revenue for just being hooked up. Because if you're not hooked up to the system, your home, your business isn't worth what you think it is. And you are extracting value by just being attached to the system. So we need to find a mechanism to capture that revenue. Thank you. And I have to leave at 11 o'clock, and I mean no disrespect when I do.
Thank you, Mark.
Someone else, you had a question, sir. Please, Donna.
Yeah, and Mike brings up a good point. You do have to pay for the initial connection, right? So you pay the connection fee when you tap into the system.
Which is pretty substantial. Okay, I'm sorry.
Hi, my name's Bob Lawrence, and I'd like to commend you guys because I think you've done a marvelous, detailed, in-depth job beyond my expectations, professor or not. Uh, And, you know, I also like your philosophy of the consumption fee. Use more, pay more, use less, pay less. But that assumption is true whether you have one fixed rate or a demand and a non-demand rate. You use more, you pay more, you use less, you pay less. And in fact, if you use more during the peak period, you actually pay noticeably more than if you use more during the non-peak period. So it actually helps conservation during the summer times or the peak period, whether it's for irrigation or other things, if the water rates are higher then. As I've listened to all the things that go over the internet, next door, all the emails, what I get as the crux of the people's discomfort with what's happening is really based on what Donna has brought forth. And that is, people look at our system as sized specifically to deal with the flow rates for the summer. And when you look at the peak to average rates on the water consumption that have been put out, it's 5 to 10 to 1, 8 to 1 average. And then people say, well, if our plant was 1/3 the size, 1/4 the size, whatever the lower size would be, then the rates would be different. They would be lower because a smaller truck is less costly to operate than a big truck. Even when the big truck is empty, it costs more to operate. And so that tends to say peak and non-peak rates, which can very hard to figure out what the actual values should be because the contribution to the coffers aspect. Although right now, most of the people who come to the city don't actually make contributions specifically to the town. Like if you are in a hotel, right now, the hotel people don't make contributions to the city's revenue other than through parking meters. But that may change. So I wouldn't like to go down that way, but recognizing that there is a sense out there that we pay more because of the higher peak demand, because we've built a larger facility. And we could easily have the total approach that we've taken here, but just have a slight difference in rates to contribute to that sense, which would also help conservation, generate the exact same amount of revenue for the city over the exact same annual period of time, but just distribute it a little differently as to who pays what. And I think a lot of people would feel that would be a lot better and could be just as easily justified. And if you'll pardon me paraphrasing your words, Mike, decisions are made on criteria, but what criteria should we use? And I think that's what we're all about. Should we have flat, or should we say, due to the sizing of the plant, a little bit more in the summer and a little less in non-peak? What's our criteria?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bob.
Yes.
I also commend what the utility
Name?
working group.
Your name and address,
Oh,
please.
sorry, Suzanne Good, 1 Grove Street, apologies. I also commend what Mike and the others on the group have done, but I, from the beginning, was worried that an existing system, which did reflect the residents, full-timers, being perhaps 1,500, at most 1,800, and on a peak summer weekend, you could have 40,000 people in the town. It seemed apparent to me that even if you only count those 2 extra employees in the summer, that the system scale is driven by the peak demand in the summer. This seems like bad timing to abolish that one benefit of peak versus non-peak rates for those of us who live here year-round, especially when we're not adopting the inclining block structure, which would have helped small households. Most of the full-time residents, myself included, I live with my husband and 1 teenager, are small households. So our water consumption is far smaller than commercial businesses. The other reason I think peak and non-peak rates absolutely makes sense. In addition to reading a National Bureau of Economic Research study, which indicated for resorts, they cited the Outer Banks of North Carolina as an example, where peak and non-peak rates seem to be the precedent, is that a disproportionate number of the peak users from April to September 30th tend to be hotels, restaurants, and investors who are using a Schedule E on their property, which they're renting out on Airbnb or whatever else. So those commercial users and investors are able to deduct the full cost of their water bill and wastewater bill from their taxes, either through Schedule E or if they're a hotel, for their business, their corporate taxes. In addition, I have a problem for some of us who moved here not realizing there would be this precipitous rise in water and wastewater rates, that the cost of installing a separate irrigation meter in this city is almost prohibitive, $3,000, is that correct, Manager Lynn? And in order to amortize $3,000, a person would have to be confident of living here for a long time. So it's sort of a deterrent. I know Mr. Mayor has cited several times that he personally has one of these irrigation meters, but it's not really on the horizon for a lot of us. So I feel that the discussion, unfortunately, I respect what you've done, and there are a million ways to view equity. I've spoken to Mike after at least 2 of the meetings about this, but I totally agree with Donna. I think this is the timing of removing a peak and non-peak rates, which are approximately, the peak rate is approximately 50% higher than the non-peak. It's ill-timed to me, and I hope you will reinstitute the peak and non-peak rate structure that is April 1st to September 30th for peak and October 1st to March 31st non-peak. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir.
My name is Tom DePasquale, and I live at 11 Queen Street, and I don't know how many years it takes to be a long resident. We've lived there for 7 years now. Guys, I think the math is wrong here. I think if you actually check the math of building the first structure versus the next 20% versus the next 30% is much closer to their non-issue than you think. And if anyone thinks this massive subsidy is, I bet running water in January when it's freezing is probably more expensive than running water in a warmer month. So I really think we have such a great city, and you have such amazing taxes and everything else. This issue should commend this group. The fact that you're doing it once every 4 years versus every year, great idea, and I think you should move forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? If not, Donna will be the last one.
Thank you very much. Donna Mabry, 221 Hickman. I just want to point out that the example of the cost differential, the $14 you mentioned, I'm not sure those figures. I know for myself, being a small user, it would certainly be more than that. But as a small user, it won't impact me all that much. But it will impact the big users in the off-season. And that'd be like the restaurants. So that it will have thousands of dollars of impact on them. So you need to look at some of those big users. I think there's some data with that. And I think about this for me, it's not so much the cost to me personally, it's more the principle. It is a principle, and it is the value, and it's a principle of being equitable. I think it is really shifting costs from seasonal users to year-round users, and those year-round users are like your easiest to supply. And I guess when you look at it as to the value of, like, I would subsidize education. I have no children in school because that's a value. But for me, to subsidize the seasonal people, that means I'd be subsidizing a luxury vacation. So I don't know that I need to subsidize somebody's vacation. And I don't know that I need to subsidize the biggest, most profitable businesses in town. You know, that they're doing well, the hotels, large restaurants. So I think as far as like how we contribute to a town or society, I don't think we need to subsidize those things. And we're such a seasonal community. It's not like we can absorb extra costs with water. Then what else do we absorb the seasonal costs? You know, that a small population like this cannot absorb so many costs for such a large seasonal influx. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions from, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, please. I would point out that, as was pointed out earlier, that the peak the peakness, as I call it, as opposed to peak, non-peak, is actually in the calculation, and in fact, the difference is nominal. However, I think what's important is the way that we did this, is that this represents the zero-base budget, if you will, so that you can build or change as you see fit from a value judgment. And I'm pleased to see that most people philosophically supported what we did, but the analytics represent the baseline. The question of inclining blocks to encourage conservation, those are value judgments now. You've got the core data that says this is the starting point. And based on your subsequent meeting and subsequent folks are going to make comments, you're now into the area of value judgment. So we hopefully have armed you with the base data that is absolutely valid, is concrete to the best of our ability to go forward and reflects the future, not just today. It represents a perspective that was built and looked at for the next 10, 20 years, actually more than that. And then bringing it back today as to what we have to face and what we have to do. So I would like to sort of go to that, and the fact that we have a baseline to start, but the value judgments, whether it's peak, non-peak, in a different perspective, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, that's your call.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mike.
On the peak, non-peak, which I can appreciate until you get, into the depth of the numbers, it's a hard concept to understand. But on the executive summary, if you look at beginning about the middle of page 2, actually the first discussion is a little higher up under utility working group methodology, but focus on, you might have to read this 3 times. I had to wrap my mind around it, to explain the difference between fixed cost and non-fixed cost, which we've discussed. And I think the key thing to keep in mind is look at the total flow of wastewater and water, which is down at the bottom of page 2, 187 million gallons versus 197 million gallons for water. That is the year-round total flow. The peak flow is 140 million for wastewater and 150 million for water. So those were the numbers, the peaks that were used to generate the portion of the cost that's related to non-fixed costs. So a very substantial, that's about 75% of the total flow of the year has been assigned to the non-fixed cost, which are those costs that are variable, that are driven by the fact that you need more chemicals, you need more electric, you have more debt service, all of those things that were in the, quote, peak before. But we couldn't find how the previous peak number was generated. It was, I'm sure the people at the time thought it was legitimate 20 years ago or whenever it was implemented, but we couldn't find any numerical rational basis for it. That's what we tried to do in our process. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
If there's nothing else, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much to